We're going to talk today about a comparison between Baptists and other professing Christian groups. We're going to talk about a comparison between Baptist distinctives and the distinctives of other groups. But let me say a word before I do. We're living in an increasingly confusing age. Even when I was a boy, the Methodist meant something. Presbyterian meant something. Baptist meant something. Lutheran meant something. That becomes less true with every passing year. So when I'm going to talk here about what a Methodist is, what a Lutheran is, I'm talking about the historical meanings of those words. Who was I talking? Brother Barr, I think I was talking to. We were talking about a Baptist church that was actually charismatic. That was unheard of 20 years ago. Even 10 years ago, that was really, really strange. Today it happens. Okay? I have come across Roman Catholic churches that don't teach any Roman Catholic doctrine. Lutheran churches that don't teach any Lutheran doctrine. So when I use these words, I have to be talking about the historic sense. That doesn't necessarily mean the church on the corner of the street where you live fits this definition. More and more there is a blending and a merging so that there's no distinctiveness between the churches. I mean, it's just amazing. I find that scarier than just disagreeing with folks on doctrine. I'd rather know a Lutheran's a Lutheran and know the points we agree on and know the points we disagree on than not have any idea what a Lutheran is. But it doesn't matter what I think about it, we're living in that day. And I will tell you that has hit Baptist churches too. Now, it hasn't hit Baptist churches quite as hard as some of the other groups, but it's here and it's growing. And there's a growing community church movement, which is the movement that brags about not having distinctives. So, I mean, this becomes a really confused mess. But at least for some perspective, we're going to talk about the historic doctrine of these movements and compare the Baptist distinctives with the historic doctrines of these movements. Okay, and that's lesson 4. So Roman numeral 1 under that is modernism. They just say simply, modernism denies that the Bible is any authority at all. Modernism denies that the Bible is any authority at all. It's clear at the other end from the Baptist distinctive. We say the Bible is the sole authority. Modernist says the Bible is no authority. And you have modernists who go by every name tag. You have modernist Methodists. They don't believe what historic Methodists believe. You have modernist Baptists. You have modernist Catholics. You have modernist Baptists. And that's tragic, but I will tell you, modernism has completely overtaken some of the biggest groups of Baptists to the point that the modernists far outnumber the Bible believers. That's true in the American Baptist Convention. That's true in the National Baptist Convention. That's true in the Progressive Baptist Convention. There's a running battle over the issue of modernism in the Southern Baptist Convention. And so when you're dealing with somebody that is a modernist, it throws all of this off. A modernist Baptist may not believe anything that you and I believe. They may not believe one of the fundamentals of the faith, and they may not believe one of the Baptist distinctives. But they still might have the title Baptist on their church door. Okay? That, by the way, and it throws some people. I mean, our president's a Baptist. Okay? Our vice president's a Baptist. Speaker Gingrich is a Baptist. Trent Lott is a Baptist. 4 most powerful political people in the country are Baptists. I mean, that ought to spell real good news for this country, shouldn't it? It would if any of them had the faintest idea what a historic Baptist was, and they were that. I don't know. I don't know about Mr. Lott. I can promise you that Mr. Gingrich and Mr. Clinton and Mr. Gore do not belong to historic Baptist churches, but they do belong to churches that have the name Baptist on the door. Okay? I've seen concern. It's like we never learn. I've seen the very people who know the real problems with Mr. Clinton be reassured because Mr. Gingrich is a Baptist. Well, I'm going to tell you, there are plenty of modernist Baptist churches around. Jimmy Carter was a Baptist. But a lot of folks didn't ask what kind of Baptist church he belonged to. He belonged to a modernist church. That should have told us volumes. Okay? Well, modernism is, you want to compare modernists to a Baptist? Real simple. We're the opposite of each other. A modernist believes the Bible is no authority. We believe the Bible is the only authority. How do you get any more opposites than that? Okay. Roman numeral 2, Roman Catholicism. Okay. I'm going to sum it up by saying this, but then we'll talk about it a little bit. Roman Catholics and Baptists disagree on every one of the Baptist distinctives. They disagree on every one of the Baptist distinctives and some of the fundamentals of the faith. Between two different terms here. Fundamentals of the faith are those basic historic doctrines that no one has a right to call themselves Christian if they don't believe in them. Remember, we talked about those in the first class? The Trinity, the doctrine of Scripture, doctrine of salvation, deity of Christ, so forth. The Baptist distinctives are what you should have been able to reproduce for me on the little quiz we had on Tuesday. These are the distinctive doctrines that make up the background of the name Baptist. Okay? Distinctive doctrine. It's possible to be a fundamentalist without being a Baptist. Not possible to be a Baptist without being a fundamentalist. Fundamentalists believe the Bible is inspired and infallible. If you don't believe that, how in the world could you make it the sole authority? So all real Baptists are real fundamentalists. Not all real fundamentalists are Baptists. In the beginning of the fundamentalist movement, there were a number of people who were prominent in it who did not hold to all the Baptist distinctives. So I'm going to use these two terms as we look at these groups. Roman Catholics are not fundamentalists. I mean, they do claim to believe in the inspiration and infallibility of Scripture. They do claim to believe in the deity of Christ. But there's a very specific fundamental that they completely miss. Anybody quickly? Salvation by faith. They teach salvation by works. If you miss the plan of salvation, it doesn't a whole lot matter what you get right. Okay? So they're not fundamentalists. Every one of the Baptist distinctives they take a different view on. They don't believe the Bible is the sole authority. They believe the church is the sole authority. They don't believe in a regenerated church membership. How do you get to be a Catholic? Most folks. You're born a Catholic. They don't believe in baptism by immersion of believers only. They believe in baptism by sprinkling of babies. They don't believe in a priesthood of believers. They believe there's a handful of people set aside to be priests. They don't believe in separation of church and state. There was a time when the Roman Catholic Church controlled many national governments. And to this day, in South American countries, you'll often see a union of church and state with Catholicism. They don't believe any of the Baptist distinctives. Okay, Roman numeral 3. Presbyterians. Again, this is where we get into a day and age in which things are changing so much. But most Presbyterians today are modernists. But not all. A historic Presbyterian did believe in the fundamentals of the faith, but doesn't believe in any of the Baptist distinctives. Now, I will have to tell you, I believe that is changing more and more as Presbyterian churches get less tied to their roots. I know a number of immersionist-only Presbyterians. That's not historic. That's their... to be honest with you, I don't know how they get to that place. But I know several Presbyterian churches that don't sprinkle anymore. I really think it's a certain amount of pressure put on them by people who do teach the truth. I was acquainted with a situation when I was a teacher at Indiana Baptist College. We had a Presbyterian pastor who drove over an hour and a half every morning from Illinois to go to our college. He really wanted some training. Managed to get called as a Presbyterian preacher and there at the church, but really didn't have any training. He wanted some. He'd come over, go to our school. Kind of be expected. He got confronted with Baptist doctrine all the time that began to influence him. He decided he would not sprinkle anyone anymore. Decided he wouldn't baptize babies anymore. And so this will show you the difference in the way a Presbyterian church is set up and the way a Baptist church is set up. Presbyterians have what they call the presbytery, and that is all the Presbyterian preachers in a given area. They can come together and make decisions that are binding on all the churches. So when this fellow became an immersionist, he would not sprinkle anymore, and he would not baptize babies anymore. The presbytery, and I know I don't pronounce that word right, but that's one of those I've tried and I can't get it exactly right, got together, and there were 7 preachers, counting him, in their little local Presbyterian council. They got together and voted 6-1 that he couldn't do that. They don't have fully independent churches. They got together and voted. It was really quite an interesting thing. They got together and voted 6-1 that he couldn't do that. his people in the church stood by him because he'd taught them from the Scriptures and they were willing to listen. So they decided to leave the Presbyterian church and form an independent church that would be an immersionist church. Only when they voted to do that, came back and said, no, the denomination owns the building. So they left the building behind. Then they found out there's a little quirk. The guy that deeded the building to the guy that donated the building to the Presbyterian church like 80 years before, something like that, had written in the deed that if the denomination ever pulled the church building from the people, they had to give it back to his family. And his family was still in the church and supported the pastor. So they had to give it back to the family, and the family gave it to the church. But you can see you are not dealing with an independent church in that setting. Okay, you see the difference between that and the Baptist distinctive of the independent autonomous church. They ended up with an independent autonomous church, 2 years later, and a couple of court things and so forth. But you see the difference? Even though we read about people like Warfield and Machen, and they fought for the truth when they were arguing, the battle was over the inspiration of the Bible. When the battle was over the Trinity, when the battle was over the virgin birth, they fought for those truths. But there is a difference between them and us when you come to all of these Baptist distinctives. For them, the Bible is not the sole authority because there is a church council that has some authority. Okay? They did not practice baptism by immersion of believers only. None of the Baptist distinctives are historic Presbyterian doctrine, even though you will come across some Presbyterians today who believe some of them. Okay? Roman number 4. The Methodists. Now, I will tell you, it has become harder and harder to find a historic Methodist. A Methodist that believes what John Wesley believed. John Wesley's a fellow who came out of the Church of England teaching salvation by faith, and that message spread through England and then spread through the colonies, and God used it tremendously because the thing that John Wesley went out and spent most of his time preaching was the truth. God will bless His truth. Even if a person delivering it misunderstands something else, God will bless the truth when it's preached, and most of what John Wesley preached was the truth. However, that doesn't change the fact that when he realized because of preaching salvation by faith, he had to leave the Methodist, or had to leave the Church of England and form new churches. That doesn't justify the fact that the issue, the fight was over, that he was right about, doesn't mean that every doctrine that he taught he was right about. And the truth was, when the Methodists formed into a group, the individual Methodist churches were allowed to believe whatever they wanted to about baptism. But most of them practiced the sprinkling of babies. Some of them would not sprinkle babies, but they would sprinkle adults. There are a handful of immersionist Methodists. This throws people off when they talk about Bob Jones University, because it was founded by Bob Jones Sr., who was a prominent Methodist evangelist. He actually was an immersionist. He grew up in a Methodist church that practiced immersion, but he was a Methodist. And that shows in some of the ways that Bob Jones University was organized, particularly their attitude on the local church. Okay? Now, Methodists tend to believe in the historic Methodists. You'll still find a few. They tend to believe in the priesthood of the believer and the separation of church and state. Yes, historic Methodists tend to believe in the priesthood of the believer and the separation of church and state. But they don't normally believe the rest of the Baptist distinctives. They don't normally believe the rest of the Baptist distinctives. In my lifetime, doing a good bit of traveling, because of some of the political topics I deal with, speaking before diverse groups, I have met one historic Methodist preacher in 25 years. Can't deny that they're there. I'm just telling you, there's not a lot of them to go around. There is, I'm told it's more prominent in like South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee, through that area. I'm told there are a number of Methodist churches that have left the United Methodist, and they've left the Free Methodist. The Free Methodist split from the United Methodist over slavery, over 100 years ago, but they've had their own problems with modernism and so forth too. I'm told there are a number of independent Methodists now, just individual congregations, and number of, I know they're independent Presbyterians. I've met some of them. What's ironic, they won't join the groups because of modernism. In order to be free, not to be modernist, they become an independent congregation. But when they do that, they just discovered one thing we knew all along: the independent autonomous church. When you study the influence of modernism, where you find modernism having its least influence are among independent Baptists and among independent Pentecostals. Why do they have their least influence there? Most people don't jump at the chance to be modernist. They accept it because of political pressure from the denomination. When there's no denomination, there's no political pressure. Just for example, what pressure is on there on Landmark Baptist Church to be modernist? Absolutely none. Modernism doesn't do well in independent circles. The irony is there are people who have a religious tradition for centuries that said, belong to a denomination, that are now forming independent congregations. They're just figuring something out, something we knew all along. An independent church is the church that's free to respond to the Bible as the only authority. It's a church that's free to respond to the will of the Lord. You do find a number of groups that are out of the historic Methodist tradition: the Wesleyans, the Nazarenes, the Pilgrims Holiness, all those folks. That's the historic Methodist tradition. But frankly, all those groups have been hit by modernism hard. All right, the Pilgrims Holiness used to be famous 30 years ago. Pilgrims Holiness was famous because they had such strict standards. For them, that wasn't a good teaching, because they were teaching those strict standards were part of salvation. But they had stricter standards than what we have here at Landmark Baptist College. 30 years later, there's modernism all through the thing. And that's tragic, but that is what has happened. It's what happens when you have a denomination and people get accepted because they belong to the group rather than because of what they stand for. Okay? Roman numeral 5. Pentecostalism. Let me say a word introduction before you put anything else down. This throws some people because most Pentecostals would claim to believe most of the Baptist distinctives. And so some people would see there to be a real unity between Baptists and Pentecostals because they're not, but there's not, and here's why. The one they miss will influence your attitude on all the rest. Okay? They don't believe, a Pentecostal does not believe the Bible is the sole authority. Most of them have independent churches. Most of them practice baptism by immersion. Most of them believe in separation of church and state. Most of them believe in in fact, I've never met a Pentecostal who didn't believe in a priesthood of the believer. But they don't believe the Bible is the sole authority. By definition, they don't. Why not? Yes. Okay, they believe they're still getting revelation from God. They're still getting. Some of them got authority last night in the service, they think. They believe a Pentecostal is someone who believes the apostolic gifts are still for today. So they believe the Lord is still giving revelation. And while I think some of them are saved, and I think some of them mean well, if you think you're still getting revelation from God, you're in trouble in a hurry. They believe that they're still getting messages from God that have the authority of Scripture. Some classic famous ones. Okay, Oral Roberts, his famous revelation he gets where God supposedly tells him unless he raises $9 million for their project, in a certain period of time, God's going to kill him. Okay, all the time. Anybody that does this, there's a degree of danger with. But some of them get wilder revelations than others. But I'll give you an example recently. I know of a young lady in a Pentecostal church who got up Wednesday night service, said she was having a revelation from God, and that she was supposed to be a Sunday school teacher. So then everybody's just in awe. Well, got a revelation from God, make somebody a Sunday school teacher, what are you going to do? Make them a Sunday school teacher, right? Only problem was she didn't have the moral qualifications to be a member of the church, much less to be a Sunday school teacher. But since she had a revelation from God, and they were having a service and asking God to give revelations, that did have to be revelation from God, didn't it? They made her Sunday school teacher. And then became aware of dramatic problems in her life that would indicate you didn't want her teaching a Sunday school class. See, Doesn't matter what form you think it comes in. I will tell you, when you think you're hearing God's voice speaking to you in an audible fashion, you are probably hearing yourself tell you what you want to hear. And if you're really hearing an audible voice, it's not God, and it's a whole lot worse. I'd rather you hear yourself tell you what you want to hear. I mean, this is a dangerous business. People do it all the time. This movement is growing. There's a real sensation to it. I don't know how many of you ever been in a Pentecostal service? Okay, and a number of you. If you see what's done to build people up to the place where they're emotional enough to have these experiences, it will tell you the Spirit of God. You don't find in Scripture when God's about to give somebody revelation, He's got to get them worked up first. You don't have to get worked up to get revelation. You have to get worked up to have your own emotions stirred to the place that you believe things you wouldn't believe otherwise. I have, the first time I ever was in a Pentecostal service, I was in Bible college. And a friend of mine, in fact, he had a friend from Bob Jones, and he was home for the summer, and we were working at camp together, and we were actually, the whole camp staff was supposed to be at a church to do a particular service, but I had just been there and preached for them the week before, so I knew they didn't really need me to get up and give my testimony and all. We said, man, we had all these questions about what Pentecostals are like. To be real honest, we just snuck out from the group and went to Pentecostal church. I'm trying to lay the groundwork, but there really ain't any way to defend it. We just did it. And so we got there and got to the service, a big Pentecostal church in Bloomington, Indiana. We went away from where we lived because we didn't want anybody we knew to see us. And, we got in a service, and they had an hour-and-a-half music service to get ready for tongues and revelation and all that stuff. Hour-and-a-half music service. There's probably 15 minutes of preaching in there. But, I mean, they had everybody in a place swinging and swaying and moving back and forth and stomping their feet. And we'd find ourselves starting to move our feet, and then we'd stop. You know, and finally, after a while, we didn't get to the tongues and the revelation and all that. Finally, I just looked at him and said, "Is this bothering you as much as it is me?" He said, "Yeah." So we left. We left for the good part. But I'm telling you, you don't have to do that if it's from God. You don't have to do that if it's from God. Okay? You find God. Moses comes along and hears God's voice out of a burning bush. How much of an emotional service did it take to get him ready for that? Yeah. You know, I mean, it's just, it's totally different than saying, this is it. And that's why I was talking to one time, one of these fellas. We actually were both asked to speak at a pro-life rally, and guy delivered a good message against abortion and all that. But we were talking afterwards, and he was telling some folks about all these things the Lord had given him, you know, people were supposed to do, and I can't remember what they all were now. They weren't biblical things, like convert all your assets into gold and silver, stuff like that, I think was one of them and all that. And I just finally couldn't let it pass without saying something about it. Finally said, you know, it's not in the book. It's not from God. It might be good advice, but it's from man if it's not in the book. And I remember what he asked, or the question he asked me. He said, "Are you disputing my personal testimony?" I don't care anything about his personal testimony one way or the other. I mean, I'm a Baptist. I believe this is the only authority. His personal testimony is irrelevant. I mean, it's irrelevant. And you see the difference, though. A historic Pentecostal will tell you they believe in the inspiration of the Bible and all that. Some of them even understand the King James Bible issue. But even those that understand the King James Bible issue will tell you that the King James Bible is an authority, and the revelation they get from God is the rest of the authority. That's a complete difference between that and believing the Bible is the sole authority. Okay? I have, since that day when I was a college student, 3 times been present when people thought they were exercising the gifts of the Spirit. I'll tell you about the last one. I got asked by a friend to go to this preacher's meeting. It's a group of Pentecostal preachers. A lot of Pentecostal preachers teach salvation by works. Some of them don't. Some of them teach salvation by faith. They were having a preacher's meeting in Indianapolis. A friend of mine who was an independent Baptist had gone to it a couple times. Said, "I wish you'd go." Said, "This is an amazing thing." Said, "There's a bunch of these guys that were teaching salvation by works, discovered salvation by faith." And he said, "I wish they could meet some good, sound folks." And there's a Pentecostal preachers meeting. They had them all together, and they were up talking about all these wonderful things they discovered, salvation by grace and all that. So I'm, just sitting there behaving myself through the thing. And then they got started sharing stories. And I don't know how to put this. It was the miracle of the week story. And, so one guy would tell about the miracle at his church, But the next guy had to have a better story. And the guy after that had to have a better story. And pretty quick they got to telling stories about raising people from the dead. You know, and I'm not cut out to sit in that stuff. I'm sitting. My friends wanting me to behave. You know, I'm sitting there saying, I pull out a sheet of paper and a pen. And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I want to get the names and address of these folks." I mean, I've lived in Indianapolis all my life. You know, at that time, I'd lived in Indianapolis all my life. So they give me a name and address, I can find any spot in Indianapolis. I'd like to go talk to these folks. I mean, that'd be something. And he kept encouraging me not to make a scene. And then they had prayer time, and they all got down on their knees, and they started speaking in tongues. And I got up and left. I said, whatever this isn't a God. I feel as out of place here as a man could ever feel, you know. And so far as they know, another miraculous thing happened, and I ascended to heaven, because when they opened their eyes, I was gone, and they've never seen me again. Roman numeral 6. Traditional Protestant groups. Traditional Protestant groups. I think I told you before, using the name Protestant to describe all non-Catholics is historically meaningless. Not only are Baptists not Protestants, because we existed long before the Protestant Reformation, Methodists aren't Protestants. They started after the Protestant Reformation. The Presbyterians came up in the Protestant Reformation. There are other groups that specifically come directly out of it. Groups like the Lutherans, the Episcopalians, and the Anglicans. I'm going to have you put those down under traditionalist Protestant groups. Lutheran, Episcopalian, Anglican. And frankly, these groups are so similar that in our day and age it's hard to tell the difference. Now, the Brethren is a completely different group, and I really don't have them mentioned here because we've just been dealing with the larger ones. I will say this, there's two basic groups that use the term Brethren. Three, really, if you throw in the Plymouth Brethren, and they all have a different background. One of the Brethren groups actually comes out of Baptist churches, and one of the Brethren groups actually comes out of Methodist churches, and the Plymouth Brethren developed independent of all this, for good or bad. They're a completely distinct group. But anyway, the Lutherans, Episcopalians, the Anglicans, it's almost impossible to find a historic Episcopalian or historic Anglican or historic Lutheran. But even if you could, by definition, they disagree with us on the independence of the church. These are denominational systems where the denomination owns the church and assigns pastors. Okay? This is also true among the Methodists and among some of the Presbyterians. The denomination tells you who your pastor is. See, if your pastor really does a good job, I mean, he really builds the church up, and there's a lot of things to get people's attention, he's really doing good, you've got to guarantee he's going to get moved to a bigger church. And if he's really doing a bad job, you're probably going to get stuck with him because they're not going to want to move him anywhere. I mean, it is a self-defeating system, completely apart from what's in Scripture. It's a self-defeating system. It takes a guy 5 years normally to get a church going in the direction he wants it to go. And if you got a guy that maybe he's a builder or he's a leader or he's something or other in one of these groups, about the time he gets the church really moving somewhere, they will move him to a bigger one. You don't have any say in it. This is what's happened in these denominations. There's still battles going on because they assign you a pastor. You may not know what he teaches or believes. You might have a group of people who are still Bible believers and they get a modernist preacher. I'll give you an example. Back where I lived right before I moved down here, I got acquainted with a fellow who was in his mid-70s, creating a fuss every week in his Methodist church. This fellow had grown up in that particular country church when it wasn't as modernist as many of the Methodist churches and so forth. And he really didn't understand all the issues, but he knew enough to know that homosexuality was wicked. And then they assigned a homosexual preacher at his church. And he had a fit. And he will literally go to church every week and pass out anti-homosexual information in the church. Now, what he should have done a long time ago was got out of that Methodist church. But I'll give him credit. He just won't stand there and put his stamp of approval on wickedness. Every Sunday morning, he goes in with I've provided some of it. That's one reason I know that. Every Sunday morning, he'd go in and pass out anti-homosexual literature at his church, but then sit during the morning sermon, which is the only one they have, while a homosexual preacher gets up and preaches. Now, he didn't want to, and he said half the people left the church. They didn't ask for a homosexual preacher. They got assigned one. You know why I think they got assigned one? Even in America today, homosexual preachers can't normally build a church, even a modernist church, unless it's in downtown of a big city. And I think they sent him to this little country church to get rid of him, get him out of the way. And nobody there wanted him, as far as I know. I can tell you story after story about American Baptist Convention Church. I pastored in a little town. Pastor in a little town had 3 churches in it. Every one of them had named Baptist on it. There was our church, there was a missionary Baptist church, and there was an American Baptist Convention Church. When I went there, the guy who pastored in the American Baptist Convention Church was a rank liberal. And I mean, the church was really dying. And he was older, and they let him hang on till he about killed the place. But then when he hit pension time, they pulled him out and put him on his pension. And the next preacher they sent was a fireball. I mean, just a very aggressive preacher, and actually, believe it or not, preached the plan of salvation. I mean, she was something. And, yeah. And that created a stir in the church, because some of them didn't want a woman, and some of them who might have lived with a woman didn't want a pushy woman. She was aggressive. I will tell you the honest truth. It's surprising. She'd go door to door trying to win people to Christ. She really did. She came knocked on our door. I didn't tell her who I was. I went and let her go through the whole spiel just to see what she had to say. She didn't do a bad job at all. She really didn't. And I told my wife, the sad thing is she's an improvement over what they had before. I mean, that's what's really sad about it. But they didn't have any choice in the matter. She got assigned there. And what's happening in the American Baptist Convention and the Methodist Church and Episcopal Church, they're drawing fewer and fewer men to train for the ministry and increasing numbers of women. So you're having increasing numbers of women sent to pastor these churches. Nobody has any say in the matter. Okay? Now, we have no comparison to that in our background, do we? In our independent Baptist churches, we call our own pastors. We can't imagine somebody sending us a pastor. We really can't imagine somebody sending us a pastor that stood for something different than we all did. We can't even conceive of it. But you understand the difference between believing in an independent, autonomous church and having a denominational system? I will not deny there's still some saved people and some Bible believers preaching in denominational pulpits. I won't deny that. But they've made a terrible mistake that undoes most of the good that they're trying to do by that. Everybody gets saved in one of those situations, I'm still glad for. But I'm going to say without apology to anybody, and I come across people in these situations who are saved, say, get out, get in an independent, fundamental, Bible-believing church that teaches the Baptist distinctive. You'll be a whale of a lot better off. Your spiritual life will be better, your stand will be better, and most importantly, it'll be a whole lot better for your children. Because there are people who stay in these churches, they know what the truth is, and they say, I'm going to stay and be a voice for the truth in these churches. But what's it do to your children who grow up in that? You know? Okay, well, want to move on. Roman numeral 7, the pseudo-Christian cults. I'm not going to take time to talk much about them because I want to get on to some things here. But those are groups that claim to be Christians but aren't in any sense of the word. Groups like the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Seventh-day Adventists, groups like that. They deny, all of them deny some of the fundamentals. All of them deny salvation by faith. All of them deny the Bible as the sole authority. They are neither fundamentalists or Baptists. When fundamentalists and Baptists join with them in religious endeavors, they make a terrible mistake. Yes, Brother Baker. Pseudo-Christian cults. Pseudo means false. These are all folks who claim to be Christians, but there's not any definition of the word Christian that fits them. In the time we have left, I want to talk just a little bit, Roman numeral 8, the history of the doctrine of baptism. History of the doctrine of baptism. I'm not going to put this down in formal notes because I got to cover too much territory, but I want to get some points made. Okay? Back when people were reading the Greek directly, the early New Testament church, there wasn't any debate over how to baptize people because the very Greek word that gets translated baptism is a word that means to immerse, to dip, to plunge, to cover. Okay? So when you were reading the Bible, you're just reading it, when it tells you to plunge people, to dip them, to immerse them. Not much room for arguing sprinkling over that, is there? And that is what the word baptism ought to mean in our language. Okay? The word baptism is not a wrong translation. I'm so tired of hearing people say that. It is not a wrong translation. We have changed, too many people have changed the meaning of the word baptism in English. It was the right translation. Okay? Matter of fact, the Greek word baptizo is the word that you used for washing dishes. Now hopefully, again I worry a little about you guys in the dorm, but hopefully when it comes to washing dishes, you don't take a little bit of water and sprinkle it on the dish. Okay? Very few cultures is that normal and acceptable. And I'm not eating at your house if you do that. I mean, you want the dish covered by water. Okay? So this was not a debate in the early church. The nature of baptism being by immersion was not a debate for 1,000 years. People talk about Henry VIII or Queen Elizabeth being baptized as a baby. They were, but they were immersed. Might not have been real exciting for the baby, but that's what they did even when they were baptizing babies. They stuck them under the water. Okay? There wasn't a debate over baptism as long as the Greek language was common or was well known among people. As soon as you started translating the Bible into other languages, people had to start picking what words they were going to use. In the old Latin Bible, there isn't any debate. But in some of the later Latin versions, and by later I mean 400, 500 AD, you start having people play games with the word to try and obscure the meaning. This got to be so dramatic that in the 1600s, what the English government did, and we'll talk about it more when we get there, they produced a lexicon, which is where you look up the meanings of words. They produced a lexicon that said the word baptizo meant sprinkle. But there were still enough people left that knew Greek that they didn't buy it. They didn't fall for it. They knew the word baptizo didn't mean sprinkle, and they only published one edition of that because there were just too many people that knew better. Okay? So there was not this argument about the mode of baptism for 1,000 years until people, and really the argument only comes up when the Roman Catholic Church is in a position that people don't have a copy of the Bible. And so then the priest can tell you what the Bible says, and you can't read for yourself. It's not until what we call the Dark Ages, when most people never saw a Bible in their lifetime, that this sprinkling business comes up. The word in the Greek is so clear, there isn't any need for a room for debate over it. Okay? But when people got away from having a Bible to read for themselves, they begin to be influenced by a couple of other ideas, and you might want to put these terms down. One is what's called clinic baptism. This was the practice of sprinkling people who had physical problems. Clinic baptism. It was really designed to be used in hospitals. You got somebody there dying and they get saved and they want to be baptized. I've had that happen. I've had people dying in a hospital, get saved and want to be baptized, and they want you to sprinkle some water on them. There's no way in the world you can immerse them. But they want to get baptized. But here's the reality of the matter. If you're not physically able to get baptized, sprinkling you doesn't do a thing to help you be obedient. Okay? If you're not physically able to get baptized, you're not physically able to get baptized. The thief on the cross, when he got saved, was not in a physical position to get baptized. Didn't keep him from going to heaven. You can't get baptized, you can't get baptized. Pretending something else is baptism doesn't solve anything. But they started allowing sprinkling just when a person had a physical problem. But what happens when you make a compromise like that, no matter how well intended it might have been originally? What happens when you make a compromise like that? Well, let's see, just who is it that has enough of a physical problem not to get immersed? I mean, what counts as that? Do you have to have a broken leg, or does your leg have to be cut off, or do you have to have just a sore ankle? Or you just, don't want to get wet that day? So what began as a way of dealing with sick people begins to spread. But here's what really changed the viewpoint of baptism. When you united the church and state, you became a citizen when you were baptized. So, when do you want your kids to be citizens? When do you want them to have all the blessings of citizenship? Right away, don't you? So when are you going to baptize them? If baptism is citizenship. As soon as you can. As soon as you can. That's what really started all the baby sprinkling, was when you united the church and state and baptism became citizenship. And by this time you have a Christianity that has a form of godliness but denies the power thereof. I mean, this is so clear. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the movie Charlemagne. Actually, I guess it was a miniseries. When Charlemagne tries to force the German tribes to become Christians, what does he do? He marches them down to the river. Why does he march them to the river? Why does he have his army march on either side and force all these people down to the river? If you're going to baptize these folks and quote-unquote make them Christians, wouldn't it be easier to go around with a few flasks of water and rather than move these whole groups down to the river by force? Why do you take them down to the river? It's because nobody did anything to baptize other than immerse people. That's why you had to go to the river. Now, that's not real baptism either, because it's not of believers only. But it sure was baptism by immersion. There's a reason why he had his army march those folks down to the river. Okay? But this is going to be so dramatically different. That's 800 A.D. By 1500, the 1500s, you don't have to put this down yet. You're going to put down plenty about it later. The Swiss Anabaptists, they used to murder our forefathers by drowning them. They used to say they want to be immersed so much, let us immerse them. But all of a sudden, that's brand new. These folks stood out because they believed in baptism by immersion. Because the Reformers didn't, and the Catholics didn't. And so if you baptized by immersion, you were really a minority. But in Charlemagne's time, they were still baptizing everybody by immersion. Henry VIII was baptized in the 1500s as a baby, 8 days after birth. He was baptized by immersion. But you have this dramatic change in the understanding of the Word. Well, I want us to list real quickly, in the few minutes we've got left, different views about baptism. Okay? There are three main teachings about baptism, and then historically, there's been a fourth. Three main teachings about baptism. Three main teachings about baptism. Doesn't that just have a ring to it? And doesn't that sound like just a natural quiz question? I don't know. You'll have to think about that. Number one, the Roman Catholic teaching of sprinkling infants as a part of their salvation. The Roman Catholic teaching of sprinkling infants as a part of their salvation. The Protestant teaching of sprinkling infants as church membership. The Catholic teaching of sprinkling infants as part of their salvation. The Protestant teaching of sprinkling infants as part of their church membership. And the Bible teaching, or Baptist teaching, you say it either way you want, it comes out the same. Bible teaching of baptism by immersion of believers only. Baptism by immersion of believers only. That's the Baptist teaching. Roman Catholic teaching, we're going to sprinkle babies to get them saved. The Protestant teaching, we're going to sprinkle babies to make them members of the church. The Baptist teaching, that we baptize only believers by immersion only. Imagine you folks had any experience soul winning at all. Somebody gets saved, you want to talk to them about baptism, and say, I've been baptized. I got a certificate that says I was baptized when I was 6 days old. And then you have to explain to them what baptism is. Now, real quickly, there is a fourth teaching that is relatively new. It may not sound that way to us. It's mid-1800s. That's called Campbellism. Campbellism, that is baptizing believers for their salvation. Church of Christ, folks. We're going to have to talk about that. Don't have time to do it today. That's where they baptize folks. That's what really finally makes you saved. That's what finishes the faith process. I like that phrase. So we don't believe in salvation by works. We believe in salvation by obedience. When someone can tell me what the difference between obedience and works is, I'd like to hear that. You're dismissed.